So Kate was going to give a bit of a welcome to the overall webinar series, and just before we actually begin today's webinar. So Kate, go ahead.
Over to me.
Over to you.
Thank you, Oscar. Good afternoon, everyone. I first wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land we are gathered quite diversely today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and may we embark on a future with reconciliation at its heart. So as Oscar and Greg said, my name is Professor Kate Hoy. I'm Head of Interventional Neuropsychology and Deputy Director of the Epworth Centre for Innovation in Mental Health, which is quite a mouthful. So we like to shorten that to ECIMH. But again, that's actually can be quite hard to get out in the right order sometimes, so bear with us. So I want to welcome you all to the first webinar of our monthly webinar series. So today you're going to hear from some of our past and present students, and I'm just going to really briefly introduce the centre before you guys jump into the webinar. So ECIMH is a joint Monash University and Epworth Healthcare Clinical Academic Research Centre, and it's led by Professor Paul Fitzgerald and myself. It's within Monash, we sit within the Department of Psychiatry in the Central Clinical School, and that's a school of the Faculty of Medicine. We have senior researchers in the centre, supervise students from lots of different degrees, and we supervise honours and higher degree research students. So that's usually PhD students, but we also do supervise doctoral students in the psychological sciences. So the vision of our centre is to transform therapeutic outcomes in disorders of mental health and brain function. And we do this primarily through the investigation of brain stimulation treatments for both psychiatric and neurological conditions. So we are the leading clinical brain stimulation centre in the country, and amongst the very best in the world. Our research has led to the clinical implementation of new treatments for patients actually in the clinic. And namely that's transcranial magnetic stimulation for the treatment of depression. And I'm sure you're going to hear a little bit more about transcranial magnetic stimulation today. But all the work we do, we are really, really focused on making differences for patients. And so while some of the research we do is at the early end of that, so we do a lot of investigative studies with healthy control groups, and we look at brain function and how different cognitions, what brain function underlies that, how brain stimulation can change that. All of those projects, and a lot of those are student projects, they're all geared towards ultimately how can we develop treatments and help people who are suffering these mental health and brain conditions. So we're based at the Epworth Hospital in Camberwell, which houses both our neuroscience labs and all of our clinical research activities. And we conduct research in many different patient populations, so depression and bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, as well as traumatic brain injury and dementia. We use lots of different research designs. So we use RCTs or randomised controlled trials, longitudinal studies, experimental studies, and a suite of neuroscience technologies. So in addition to brain stimulation, we use EEG, we have access to imaging technology as well. And so throughout this monthly webinar series, you're going to hear about all of the types of research we do from both students and staff, as well as a little bit about what it's like to be part of the centre on site and also via Zoom, which is how basically we've been experiencing the centre for the last little while. So we hope that you find the series informative and inspiring, and welcome. And I'll hand over now to Freya, who I believe is going to kick things off. You're on mute, Freya.
Oh. That is not a great start. Thank you, Kate. So as Kate said, we do a diverse range of research to hopefully benefit people in the community and find novel treatments for people with several conditions. And we're hosting these webinars over the next few months to give you insight about what roles in psychology look like and involve, and hopefully help you identify what direction or career pathway you want to pursue, especially because you're either in honours or third or fourth year or in your undergrad just generally, and you're not sure what pathway you want to take. And so how the webinars will work is we'll have a presentation by Jess today, as well as Greg, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of each presentation in relation to what they talked about. So there is a Q&A function just down below on the Zoom webinar screen. So you can just click on that if you want to submit a question. And then at the end, we'll go through and answer them as best as we can. Now, the session is sort of planned to be about 60 minutes, but it may run over time. You're welcome to leave, of course, if you can't stay for the whole 60 minutes or a little bit after if we do go over time, but just to give you a bit of forewarning. So I will introduce Jess, who's going to be talking about some PhD tips and her insights. So Jessica Michael is a second-year PhD candidate at ECIMH. Her PhD focuses on finding biological markers of anxiety disorders that can be modulated by non-invasive brain stimulation technologies, which may lead to future novel anxiety treatments. She's also teaching associate for the Monash University Graduate Diploma of Psychology program. So yes, take it away, Jessica.
Thanks so much for your intro, Freya. I'll just share screen just one moment. So hi everyone, I'm Jess, and today I'm here to talk about my honours and PhD journey and offer some tips and tricks that I've learnt along the way that I hope will help you all along your journeys. So for today's presentation, we'll start with a brief tour of my journey so far, followed by a general roadmap of pathways in psychology. We'll then have a look at honours, followed by the PhD, and for each we'll discuss the selection process, some past projects we've done here at ECIMH, general tips, and have a look at the workload. Then we'll end with some general tips about time management and managing stress that are important for every program. So a little about me. I graduated from an art science double degree majoring in psychology and genetics back in 2017. And although I was initially torn which way I wanted to go, I eventually decided firmly to pursue psychology and completed my honours year in 2018. Last year, I began my PhD journey through the Translational Research Program, where I received a bridging scholarship, and now I'm in the second year of the program. So here's a brief roadmap of the general pathways in psychology. Everyone starts with a 10-unit psychology major completed through their undergraduate degree or the graduate diploma of psychology. So from here, if you'd like to go on to be a psychologist or pursue research, you will need to complete a 1-year honours degree or its equivalent, the Graduate Diploma of Psychology Advanced or the Graduate Diploma of Professional Psychology. However, if you find after completing the major that maybe research isn't for you, or you don't want to be a clinical psychologist, there are alternate career pathways available, such as the Masters of Counselling or Social Work, or other allied health fields that can be pursued with a psychology major on its own. After honours, you're eligible to pursue a research pathway, either through a master's or PhD program. This is where I am at the moment, pursuing a research PhD. This can lead to jobs in academia, such as postdoctoral positions, lecturing, and if you stick around long enough, professorship. However, a PhD can also lead to jobs in industry, such as contributing to research or data analysis in government, policy, or in private companies. However, another option after honours is to apply for any clinical psychologist master's or PhD programs. There are many different specialties and courses available to become different kinds of psychologists, such as a clinical psychologist, neuropsychologist, educational psychologist, and many more. As I'm pursuing a research rather than a clinical pathway, this will not be the focus of my presentation today. but some specialties will be discussed in future presentations in this webinar program. So, what are some key differences between doing an honours and a PhD, and what are some good things to know along the way? So firstly, let's begin with honours. The honours program is usually a 1-year full-time degree. In a psychology honours program, you have 2 units of coursework per semester and your honours project or thesis to work on the entire year. The Graduate Diploma of Professional Psychology is essentially the same, but offers different elective units to the standard honours program and is more closely linked to educational psychology clinical pathways. Conversely, the Graduate Diploma of Psychology Advanced is an online equivalent of honours, which takes 1.5 years part-time and cannot be done full-time. However, it is still equivalent to the honours program. Getting into these programs is a competitive process. First and foremost, your grades do matter. Monash takes your average grades across your 2nd and 3rd year level undergraduate psychology units into account in the selection process. A minimum distinction average is required to be eligible for entry, but in reality, your average likely needs to be closer to 80 as these programs are competitive. This is where having relevant psychology-based experiences will help put the edge on your application. When I applied for honours, I had completed 2 psychology-based internships, one related to a PhD candidate's research and another related to shadowing a psychologist in his everyday practice. I also took up volunteering opportunities relevant to psychology. Make the most of any and all opportunities available to you. I applied for many internships before being accepted. These are often posted on Moodle forums, and I strongly recommend applying to any and all that are relevant to you. So what kind of honours projects have been done in the past? My honours year was about investigating if RTMS, or repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a form of non-invasive brain stimulation, could target brain-heart pathways, which could help improve RTMS treatments of depression. And this research is still ongoing today in later papers. Other past projects have investigated topics such as mindfulness and working memory, and how they are modulated by brain stimulation technologies. Once you're in the honours program, it's important to know that everyone's project will have different timelines, but generally you will come on board to an already designed project which has ethics already approved or is close to approval. Depending how long the approval process takes will be how long you have to do recruitment, analyse results, and write up your thesis. For honours, although some program structures force you to do this, the psychology program doesn't. I would highly, highly recommend completing your introduction or background or literature review for your thesis as soon in the year as possible, definitely before the first semester ends. This will be the time in the year where you're least busy, as you will likely be waiting for paperwork for ethics. Having the fundamentals down helps a lot with motivation for completing your thesis, and will help you craft a better discussion, as you'll have the background down pat and more easily recognise how your results are different or the same as what is expected in your field. I would finally add that recruitment is hard. Don't underestimate how long it will take to find who you need for your project. You'll also need to account for data issues and participants dropping out. Be persistent and get advertising early, because it's all worth it in the end. Regarding the workload, I would describe the honours year as a sprint. In your academic life, going from undergrad to honours is a shock for many, similar to going from year 10 into the VCE. Expect things to be very different and more intense than other undergrad years. You will have a lot more responsibility as you're in charge of your project getting enough quality data to make a good thesis. And while that's exciting, it can sometimes be a little scary too. Your work does not end until your thesis is handed in. Although in my year's case, we still had one exam and an assignment to go afterwards. You will likely put yourself at a disadvantage if you don't make use of the times of the year without coursework to solely work on your thesis or recruitment or data analysis. I recommend planning something exciting for the end of the year to look forward to after your thesis and year is finished. Regarding job commitments outside of honours, as the honours program is usually only 1 year, it's not uncommon for students to not work or work limited hours so that they have the time to complete their projects. I would recommend working limited hours or not at all if your financial situation allows it, because it's a very intense year and burnout can be very real. However, programs such as the Graduate Diploma of Psychology Advanced are more flexible in that they are part-time and online, allowing more options to balance work and study commitments. So, what about PhDs? Unlike in honours, you have 4 years in your PhD if you're going full-time, or 8 years if you're going part-time. Admission into a PhD is strongly based on your past research experience, which for most of us would be our honours grades. Usually a high distinction to a distinction average is the minimum entry requirement. However, many students after their honours may choose to become a research assistant, which also helps towards research experience that could help you get into a PhD. It's also a great way to get a feel for what research is like before committing to a PhD program. I will also add that whilst research PhDs can be competitive, clinical programs are far more so don't be afraid to apply. When going through the admission process, you will need to contact supervisors who are researching in fields of interest to you and present them a research proposal that you have come up with. From here, you will open a dialogue, which may include you and a potential supervisor planning a proposal together. Your grades may help you get an initial look from a prospective supervisor. However, it can also depend on other factors, such as how many other students they're supervising, so if there's spots available, the scope of your project, and if there are available resources such as funding and equipment to investigate your project. If you can get a potential supervisor to agree to the feasibility of your proposal, you would then go through the official online PhD application process. This is quite a long, detailed process, as your past academic, research, and relevant work experiences are taken into account in this application. However, if you decide to change fields between your PhD and honours, you might need other external experiences to validate that you would have the skills required for such a project, or be able to demonstrate that you can learn said skills during your PhD program. So here's a general display of the kinds of PhD projects running at Epworth at the moment. So while I'm investigating anxiety disorders, as Freya said in my introduction, I also have members of my cohort researching depression, schizophrenia, Huntington's disease, obsessive compulsive disorder, and mindfulness, and how treatments in these areas could improve with different brain stimulation technologies. These technologies will be covered in more detail in another one of our webinar series. In comparison to the intense sprint of honours, a PhD, on the other hand, can be best described as a marathon. In a PhD, you lead the way. You design the project, complete all the paperwork to get ethics and governance approval, acquire all your tests and equipment, recruit and do data analysis and write-ups to your own deadlines. You learn the skills needed to achieve all that as you go, which can be immensely exciting and really freeing. However, time management can be one of the biggest challenges for PhDs, as you will lead on guiding your own deadlines for projects so that you can pass milestones, more on that later, and complete your PhD on time. Your supervisor is there to make sure your plans and deadlines are feasible and to hold you accountable for your work. This is very important. Often the main reason that someone doesn't obtain their PhD isn't because they didn't pass their thesis. Often you're very passionate to get to the point of writing an entire thesis and you've worked really hard. Instead, the reason someone doesn't obtain their PhD is because they burn out and then they drop out. Therefore, learning to manage your time effectively and keeping on top of your mental health is absolutely crucial to completing a PhD. Your workload can be very heavy or very light, depending on which stage you're up to. But if you're in a light stage, it's often recommended spending that time to gain valuable related skills for your field. This could be improving your data analysis skills, career skills, or even soft skills. You're also perhaps for the first time almost entirely in charge of your own schedule. There are no exams or assignments unless your PhD mode requires coursework, only passing milestones. Milestones occur generally yearly throughout your PhD and are when you present what you've achieved so far to a panel who deem if you pass based on how much you've achieved in the set time and what is reasonable for your field and circumstances. They will ask you many questions and raise any concerns that they may have to ensure you understand your project and you're making the best decisions for it. It's also pretty common for individuals to switch between full and part-time in a PhD and to take breaks to make the most of opportunities, such as international conferences or taking part in competitive programs and experiences. It's all entirely up to you and what you arrange with your supervisor. Regarding jobs and your PhD, if you have a full-time load, you must be working on your PhD at least 4 out of 5 weekdays during business hours. If you're part-time, it's at least 2 out of 5. As long as you meet those restrictions and any further restrictions set by scholarships, you can work outside your PhD. So some general PhD tips. Publish, publish, publish. You probably heard this before, but published papers are generally the highest weighted metrics of your achievements. Remember that you don't need to be collecting data yourself to publish a paper. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses can be written by synthesizing data from other papers. Additionally, open source databases can be used for you to analyze data that can be made into publishable papers too. Think outside the box. The next highest is grants, i.e. funding that you have obtained from an external competitive selection process, which are used to fund projects. Although you might not be eligible for many grants as a PhD student, it's best to get in practice if you can. Networking also becomes really important at this stage. Research is all about collaborations and connections, and this is likely to help you with future opportunities down the line. Attend conferences, join societies and committees, make a LinkedIn and academic Twitter account, and start connecting. I highly recommend it. Going into a PhD with a specific skill set that you want to focus on, such as data analysis, science communication, etc., will help you be more competitive down the line and be more applicable to industry if that's where you end up. When it comes to the thesis, keep it simple and resist the urge to overcomplicate things. You won't get marks for it and will cause more harm than good. Stick to what's appropriate for the questions that you're asking. If you can, get teaching experience. By becoming a class tutor is also invaluable. Many academic pathways, such as becoming a lecturer, require teaching experience. Even if that's not what you want, it's an excellent way to learn soft skills, such as presenting and communicating to audiences of various levels of understanding. So in a PhD, your cohort will become your support network. Helping each other do well is heaps better than doing it solo or competitively. You're also more likely to burn out if you do everything on your own. I feel very grateful that here at Epworth, both staff and students alike are very approachable, helpful, and supportive. It would be really hard to imagine tackling my PhD without them. Imposter syndrome is also a very real phenomenon that is common to PhD students, but it does get better over time as you learn more, have more experience, and build your confidence. That being said, there's a balance here. Especially in the beginning, there is much more about your topic that you will not know than you do know. It's important to embrace a learning mindset and be kind to yourself. Don't be afraid to seek help if you're struggling. There's tutors, workshops, and more available to help with whatever skills you feel that you need a hand in. So as I pointed out, time management is a crucial skill. My biggest problem to overcome was procrastination, which turned into stressing I didn't get enough done, which turned into being unable to sleep, which turned into feeling even more stressed and overwhelmed. So here are some tips to overcome that I've learnt during my PhD so far. Have a schedule or compartmentalize your time between the hours of, for example, 9 to 5, which is your work time, with an hour or half an hour break for lunch. After 5 or your set time, do not work. This helps give you a goal to work towards and keeps you relaxed in the evening so you can sleep well. Exceptions may apply when you're nearing your thesis submission time. Have calendars of all sizes, especially crucial for the PhD, where it can be hard to plan out distant long-term goals, sometimes years in advance. Have broad year-long goals, monthly goals, weekly goals, and even daily tasks to achieve. Having this structure will help keep you focused and always feel like you're working towards a goal. It helps as well to get supervisors involved here if you're unsure of how realistic your goals are in a given time frame. Also, however long you think something will take, at least double that. Account for life getting in the way and bad days when you're not at your best, or just things not working as they should. The Pomodoro technique, fantastic for breaking up bouts of procrastination, especially when it comes to writing. Involves using a timer to spend 25 minutes with no distractions, completely focused on a task, then having a 5-minute break where you do nothing related to the task. You repeat this 4 times, but after the 4th lot of 25 minutes, you give yourself a 30-minute break. It can be especially helpful to have a tally of how many lots of 25 minutes you've done. It really helps to keep you focused knowing that there's a break ahead. There's also an app called Forest, which uses this same technique, which is also very effective, as time spent focusing gives you more points, and you use these points to plant trees of differing designs. You lose points or your tree dies if you open or use another app on your phone. It might sound a little silly, but trust me, it does work. It is free, but the paid version also helps you plant trees in the real world. Also, be kind to yourself. Not every day will be as productive as you want it to be, and you will not magically become more productive by beating yourself up about it. Life happens. Accept it and strive for better the next day. Also, expect life to get in the way. For example, in my honours year, I had a close family member be in and out of hospital for much of the year. In addition, I also had a crucial piece of equipment for our project get stuck in customs, which delayed recruitment in my project by a couple of months. Be kind to yourself when these things happen, as they're outside of your control. Always seek support when you need it. Which leads to my next and final point, managing stresses in honours and PhD programs. This is easier said than done. It's important to take time for self-care, whether that be Netflix, games, taking a long walk, or anything that helps you relax. Sleep. You'll be much more productive and feel heaps better so that stresses don't overwhelm you as much. Socialise. You're not in this alone. Keep in touch with your fellow students and your friends and family outside your programs. It's important to do all this for your mental and physical health. Being perpetually stressed puts lots of strain on your body and mind. If you put your health first, you will be more productive in the long run. Don't forget that there's Monash counsellors available. They're very helpful and supportive. Everyone is in the same boat and it's easy to become overwhelmed. So don't be afraid to reach out. Thank you. Please let me know if there's any questions.
Awesome presentation, Jess.
Thanks very much, Freya.
So we have a few questions that have come in throughout. So I guess I'll go through them and then we can kind of talk about them a bit. The first question we have is, I have completed my GDPA, have research internship experience and work as an early childhood behaviour therapist. What other experience would help me to be accepted into either a research-only PhD or clinical PhD?
Well, it sounds like you're on the right track because you've got fantastic research and clinical experiences. I'm not really sure there's much you could add to that. Research assisting, volunteering, your clinical work will help a lot if you're looking into clinical programs. It also depends on your grades. But honestly, just hearing that, I would say go for it and you've got a decent chance. Other panelists, feel free to jump in if you have anything else to contribute.
So the second question, what type of research requirements are there if we choose a path of clinical psychology? So research skills you may need to be accepted into the course.
Okay, so when we're discussing clinical pathways, they do want some research experience, but there is more of a focus on clinical skills. So I haven't actually applied into these programs. Oscar might be a better one, I think, to answer this question.
Hi, can you hear me properly?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I did the doctorate of clinical neuropsychology. and there was quite a bit of variation in the research skills you needed going in. I was accepted having never published an article, which was really based on, I guess, grades, and I had some clinical experience at that point. But for a lot of these courses, particularly at Monash, there was a large focus on research. So it's not just doing a small study, because it is a combined PhD, which means you do the equivalent of a PhD in addition to the clinical training. So just having had some experience in terms of, you know, working on your honours project, having a knowledge of how research is conducted, and anything you can do to sort of boost your research skills, I think could be really helpful for applying. That's something Greg will actually go through in the next presentation as well, about things you can do in the meantime, whether it's a summer research program, volunteering, trying to write up your honours thesis for publication, things like that. So there's definitely a lot of things you can do to boost that, and Greg will go through some of them.
Awesome. So we have another question. What is the day-to-day of both an RA, so research assistant, and PhD candidate? So I guess, Jessica, you would have experience obviously with the day-to-day of PhD. So would you like to talk about that? And then maybe I can talk about the day-to-day for an RA.
No problem, Freya. So great question. The day-to-day of a PhD candidate is wildly different depending on where you're at in your PhD program. So for example, when you're nearing the start of your PhD program, you'll be spending a lot of time just reading papers and trying to understand your field, so that you can craft what your project is actually going to be. As you move further along, that will turn more into paperwork regarding ethics and governance applications. And then as you move even further along, you'll be looking more at recruitment. So you'll be advertising, chasing up participants, screening them, and trying to get as many eligible people as possible into your project. And then while you're doing that, if you can, you'd also be doing data analysis. So for example, here at the centre, we do a lot of work with EEG, and it takes quite a lot of data analysis and processing to process our EEG data. So you definitely wouldn't want to leave that till the end when you've recruited everyone. You'd want to be doing that as you go. And then as you're nearing closer to the end of your PhD, or hopefully in the middle, depending on how you've set it up and what your data is like, you'd be looking at writing up papers to publish. And in between all this, somehow you're writing a thesis, especially towards the end. That might be all you're doing is writing a thesis. So I hope that answers your question, but yeah, it varies wildly depending on where you're at.
Great. And in terms of what a research assistant, or similar to what a research assistant would do, which are there are roles like that available that people with an honours degree can apply for. And they're at universities or independent research centres like ourselves, our ECIMH. So what an RA typically will do on a day-to-day basis is communicating with participants in the study, screening for eligibility. So going through interviews and asking questions to do with their medical history to see whether there's anything that might make it unsafe or unsafe for them to receive treatment, but also potentially might impact the research, such as existing mental health conditions that may be impacting what we're trying to look at. And also booking appointments, data collection, data management, liaising with research staff, attending clinical meetings to discuss all those potential factors that might make it unsafe or impact their eligibility. And so that's the role of an RA, and similar to a clinical trial coordinator, except clinical trial coordinators work on clinical trials. So they're looking at novel treatments that are going through the process of, I guess, working out whether they work and whether they could potentially be a publicly accessed treatment for certain disorders or conditions. And so, yeah, so RA roles are great to apply for after honours if you want to get your foot in the door and have a look at whether you like research or the clinical experience. You'll get a range of both depending on where you work and what where your role is. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your question about RAs. Another question we have, what is the difference between Masters and PhD? What are the entry requirements for Masters?
That's an excellent question. I'm not as familiar with the entry requirements for a research master's, but in terms of clinical masters, it's sort of similar to what Oscar was mentioning before. You want to have research experience and clinical experiences when you're applying to those kind of programs. I hope that answers your question.
Can I add one thing to that? So you're saying, what's the difference between a master's and a PhD? I think it's important to clarify there's two types of PhDs. One of them is just research, and then there's a clinical PhD. So if you do a research PhD in psychology, at the end of that, you are a researcher, but you're not a clinical psychologist. So you wouldn't be able to work as a psychologist in terms of therapy or something like that. Whereas the clinical PhD and the clinical masters have a combination of both the research, so the thesis, but you also have coursework units and you have clinical placements in hospitals and all those sort of things. So you would be a registered psychologist when you come out of it. And the PhD, the clinical PhD, is basically a longer version of the master's. The master's is it's 2 years. You do a year of coursework and a year of research, whereas the PhD, you do the equivalent of a full sort of a very large thesis, and you do more coursework and more clinical training, which, depending on what you're interested in, if you want to go down the research route, you would ideally want to do the PhD rather than the master's, because you'll get a lot more research experience. With a master's, you might just do a lit review and write a single paper, as opposed to PhD, where you'd write multiple different papers and try and get them published.
And what kind of, you did touch on this, Jess, a little bit, but what kind of career outcomes are there following a PhD other than academia? So I guess this is a little bit more hazy when it comes to what's out there, apart from working in academia. So yeah, if you have any insights, Jess or Oscar, about that, that'd be great.
So the skills that you learn in a PhD will influence what you can do outside of academia. So yeah, as I said in my presentation, often you'll want to focus on a specific set of skills, and that will help you spin out into industry if that's what you're interested in. So in my PhD, for example, I'm focusing on data analysis. So that could help me spin out into, governmental policies or private companies, for example. Whereas if you maybe focus more on science communication in your PhD, maybe you'd be looking more into those kind of industries after your PhD. Yeah, anything else to add, Oscar? It really varies. It depends what skills you focus on, you learn. That's
one of the tough things with something like a PhD is you're making a decision about what kind of professional you want to be. So, if you do a PhD in, say, clinical psychology, your thesis could be ways of improving the counseling experience. And so afterwards, what you're really doing is developing a really good set of skills for actually delivering therapy in a practice sense. And you might be more of someone who does therapy 3 days a week and research 2 days a week. Or you can go a really sort of experimental brain stimulation route, and then you're sort of deciding that your skills in that sense are primarily related to the research and application of new treatments. So there's a lot of scope there. So it's something definitely worth considering, if you're going to apply, because you're going to spend a long time writing a thesis. If you're not interested in the topic when you start, you're really not going to be interested after 4 years. So do some sort of introspection, maybe meditate on the topic and see what you come up with.
And I guess also in terms of pathways after PhD, that you can get roles into clinical trial coordination as well. Those are really highly sought after skills. You could also, in terms of academia, there's also research fellowships and senior research fellowships. And yeah, like Jess said, you can work for individual companies or in government with policy. So there is other pathways. It's just that they're not as well, yeah, they're not spoken about as much.
You'd be a bit creative.
Yeah. Okay, and another question. So what makes the graduate diploma of professional psychology ideal for clinical or educational students?
So it's actually a very subtle difference between the honours, the normal honours psychology program and the professional one. So the only difference is your choice of electives. So in the professional psychology program, there's a choice of electives that's specifically related to educational psychology and counselling that's not in the normal PhD program. That's the only difference as far as I'm aware. But you could definitely still go into educational psychology, having done the normal PhD program for sure.
And they may differ between universities, but a lot of the graduate diploma courses, they are equivalent to honours. It's just that you may be paying more, or they just don't have the same title, but you definitely can get similar positions, if not the same. But I guess it depends between each university, because they term it slightly differently, and they may have like slightly different, I guess, skills that they teach you. And so another question, do you have to do a clinical psychology master's degree before doing a clinical PhD?
No, not at all. You'll usually pick one or the other. So like Oscar said, if you're interested in clinical work and research work equally, you'd probably do the clinical PhD. So then you could do clinical work and research work at the same time. Whereas in the master's, the research component is more limited and it's more focused on you becoming a clinician at the end of it.
Yeah. One thing I would add to that is the clinical PhD is basically the master's on steroids. So in the master's, you might do 10 coursework units, 200 hours of placement, and a 10,000 word thesis. Whereas in the PhD, you might do 30 coursework units, 600 hours of placement, and a 70,000 word thesis. So it's a longer, more intensive PhD. So if you've done you wouldn't go from one to the other. You just decide, do I want to get it done in 2 years, or do I want to take the longer one so I can call myself doctor and get those extra skills? Yeah. One point.
All right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Freya.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, we do have a couple more questions, but maybe we'll come back to them after Greg's presentation, just so that we're not running super over time. Okay, is that all right with everybody? Yeah, great, awesome. Okay, so Greg is going to do a presentation now, primarily focusing on honours tips. Greg is a research assistant who coordinates the BrainAmp closed-loop TACS trial at ECIMH, and he also contributes to a commercially sponsored trial for treatment-resistant major depression. During his honours year, he developed a keen interest in EEG neuroimaging and has played a key role in analysing TMS EEG data at ECIMH. And he actually holds 2 honours degrees, completing his most recent one with psychology, earning him an upper first class honours degree in human psychology neuroscience from Monash University. So Greg, please take it away.
Sorry, I'll just share my screen. Here we go. All right, is that sharing now? Yep, perfect. All right. Just hello, everyone. It's so awesome to see so many people turn up. We weren't sure how many people were going to come, but it's been a great turnout, so thank you. And thanks, Freya, for the introduction, and Jess for your very insightful and detailed talk on the whole honours and PhD journey. So, as Freya said, my name is Gregory Humble, and I'm an RA at ECIMH. I was lucky enough to have attended or completed my honours year at ECIMH last year and have been working with them since December 2019. So just a bit of background. I completed a Bachelor of Fine Arts with honours at the University of Melbourne, or the Victorian College of the Arts, majoring in sculpture. That was back in 2011, and realised how hard it was to be a full-time artist, and went back to further studies. So I understand that there are some people here who have a similar story to mine. So that maybe they've done previous study and they've gone a bit older and gone on to do further studies. So good on you for doing that. I think it's really rewarding and worth it. I know there's a few people that are too intimidated to go back to study, but I think in the long run it definitely pays off. So I originally went on to do a year of biomedical science and transferred to a Bachelor of Science at Monash. I wanted to do behavioural neuroscience, but they recently disbanded that degree prior to the year that I started. So I ended up majoring in physiology and doing all of their neuroscience units. And I did a minor in psychology. So I did cover quite a lot of the units that would have been covered in the behavioural neuroscience degree. And after this, I took what was meant to just be 6 months off, but Central Clinical School, where I did my honours, no longer accepts mid-year intakes into the honours program. So I ended up having to take a full year off, but actually in hindsight, it was probably a great thing because it gave me a bit of space to mentally prepare for the honours year. Someone who's done an honours year before, just knowing how hard it is, I've just talked about it being a sprint. It really is a sprint. You're trying to cram a thesis into what's effectively maybe 8 months. So yeah, I mean, if that is an option for you to take time off, if it's not, that's totally fine. You'll still get through. But sometimes if you've got a little bit more time to prepare, that can be a good thing. So I was based at the Central Clinical School in the newly formed Department of Neuroscience as of 2019. And I was based at the Epworth Centre for Innovation and Mental Health. My research was on mindfulness neuroscience, and my primary supervisor was Dr. Neil Bailey, who'll be giving a talk at some stage during the monthly webinar series. And he's an expert in mindfulness-based research, and my secondary supervisor was Dr. Robin Cash, who's now over at the University of Melbourne. So here's just some advice that I would give my pre-honours 2019 self. So the first point, I'll just point out that it's probably not relevant to all of you, especially if you're in the psychology stream. From what I understand, in psychology, when you apply for honours, it's a bit more like a lottery process that matches you up with supervisors and projects. But if you're in the Bachelor of Science stream like I was, you have a little bit more freedom to approach potential supervisors. And my advice is to start doing this as soon as you can. Whether you're in third year, even second year, if you want to approach lecturers that are maybe using specific techniques or fields that you're definitely interested in and want to say pursue with further education post honours, try and get in early, send them an email. Supervisors are incredibly busy people, so don't feel bad if they don't reply. I think it's important to also not let them feel like you're harassing them. So give them some breathing space if they don't reply. And this sort of leads me to my next point here. So it's just about developing a good rapport with the supervisor. You're going to be spending a whole year, 5 days a week in the same lab, probably meeting with them every day or every other day. So you really want to have a good foundation and relationship with your supervisor, and try and cultivate a relationship where you feel like you can ask stupid questions. Part of this is just finding the right supervisor as well, making sure that you feel like there's open channel of communication with them. The other really important point, which I think is relevant for all areas of study, and in my, 10 years of higher education, something I've learned along the way is that of the halo effect. I think this is incredibly important. It's a cognitive bias that we all have, which is the tendency for positive impressions of a person in one area to positively influence one's opinion or feelings in other areas. So I first learned about this by reading Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So his research showed that this effect strongly influenced the gradings of students' work, funnily enough. So my advice to you is to turn up to lectures, be nice to your lecturers and tutors, ask for advice and follow that advice. If you say have a lecturer or a tutor who you think is really good at communicating, it might pay well to, it might be well just to email them and say, hey, look, really appreciated that lecture you gave today, or your teaching style, it's really good. Because when it comes to grading and marking your work, it will pay dividends in the future. And this also applies as well for looking for RA work, say in your honours year, and it's a lab that you really want to go on to do RA work. If you've got a good impression with the researchers in the lab, if an RA position comes up, you're going to be one of the first people that they think of. So go and visit your potential supervisor's lab. In particular, speak to the students in their lab. You have to be a little bit tactful about this, but you don't want to say something like, is your supervisor horrible? But you want to get some sort of understanding about whether, their supervisor is, there and provides a lot of support. There are lots of supervisors who are like leading experts in the field, but because of this, they spend, 6 months of the year in conferences and aren't actually able to give you much of their time. I think we're really lucky at ECIMH where all of our supervisors make a point to, see their students at least once, twice, 3 times a week, and we have meetings and things like that. So ECIMH's a great place, but everyone has horror stories, and I've heard of many honours students that thought that their lecturer, they had this supervisor as a lecturer, they were great, and then went on to do a project with them, and that turned out to be a really bad experience for them. So if you can, do an undergraduate research project with that potential supervisor. There are summer scholarships which allow you to do this, or research-specific units, such as the 3990 units, one of which I did. There's a link down the bottom here, but definitely investigate that. There are other scholarship opportunities, and sometimes even reaching out and being like, can I do some work experience over the summer? Even if it's just analyzing data, you'll get used to the lab and their systems, processes. It will give you a little bit of an edge. And final important point, which is something that I'm repeating from Jess, but it's an important point, is to not underestimate how hard it will be to recruit participants. I think everyone makes this mistake, and they think, oh, I'll just put out a few flyers on Monash Storgespace or on the internet, and I'll get 30, 40 respondents and I'll enroll them all. And it never works out that way. And this is particularly true if you've got a clinical population. So just understand that you will hit a bit of a wall at some point, and recruitment will slow down, and you need to find novel ways. So if you can start at the start of the year, think of some plans about how you might go about recruiting from a large distributed population. Maybe there's different groups that are related to your field of interest, maybe a clinical population, and reach out on Facebook or other mediums. I had to do something like this in my honours project with meditators, who are notoriously difficult to recruit into clinical trials, especially, research trials, especially when you're using brain stimulation techniques. Although it's a very safe technology, it's just a little bit of a hard sell for meditators. So it's something I was mindful at the start and was able to recruit well, but it was only for planning and foreshadowing that it was going to be hard that I could do that. Oh, and another point here that I have just missed, and Jess also talked about it, but just apply for scholarships. I've heard of many people that felt that they didn't meet the eligibility requirements specifically for the scholarship, but still managed to obtain it. So even if you think that you don't completely fit the bill, still apply. Try to get ahead of the curve. I talked about myself having a year off, but you will still have a summer off before you start honours if you're going straight from an undergrad into an honours program. Read your supervisor's recent papers and try to understand them. I think this is a really important point, because probably in your honours year, you're going to be using very similar analysis methods that your supervisors have used in recent papers, in particular the statistics. If it's quite complicated statistics they've used, spend that summer trying to understand them, or at least formulating the right questions to ask your supervisors when you start. I think this will definitely give you an edge, because a lot of honours students wait until they analyse their data and start running the stats and realise how difficult it actually is to interpret and run properly and effectively. So try and figure out what you know and what you don't know at the start, so that you can sort of get ahead and work on that throughout the year. Another really important point is that you don't need to win a Nobel Prize in your honours year. A lot of people make it unnecessarily complicated for themselves. Some students are given the option to tailor their project for an area that they're sort of more specifically interested in, and think, I'll just add all these different tasks into my battery or protocol, and realize that there's a lot of effort that goes into implementing them, even if they're simple things like, you know, the NBUC task. There's a lot of programming that goes into it. So just don't underestimate that. And also remember that at the end of your year, if your thesis is incredibly hard to communicate the results and the interpretation of the results, it's going to be even harder for people that are marking your paper that may be sort of in a relevant field, but not specifically. They're probably not going to be able to understand it as well, and it'll be harder for them to allocate the marks that you might otherwise deserve. Okay, so make life a little bit easier for yourself if you can. Learn to love statistics. Took me a while to love statistics in my degree, but the more you understand, in particular, just the foundations of statistics, the less you'll freeze up when you start reading really complicated papers, and the more you'll get out of reading papers if you can sort of understand the basic premises of how they've come to those interpretations, interpreted the results of their studies. Another point is to plan your year out well in advance. Most supervisors, and definitely the supervisors in our lab, require you to have a very well laid out calendar early in the year of your honours year, with all of your dates added into like a physical calendar, but also put it in your phone with multiple alerts. This is really important. I used to have dates that were like 2 weeks before my lit review was due, and it would be, your intro needs to be done today, and you need to have a plan for the rest of your lit review, or have all the formatting done and have all your papers ready. And if you miss that date, you've gone past that date and you haven't done that, you know that you're already behind, and that way you can start really trying to catch up. Another point in the summer before your honours year starts is, if you have the time and the dedication, definitely look into courses online such as Udemy. They offer courses on statistics or programming, data analysis. I used these and I found it really, really helped. Also YouTube. There are definitely going to be experts in your field out there that have posted 50, 100 videos on either your analysis method, maybe it's statistics, maybe it's something related to interpreting results, and they'll have lots of really helpful, handy videos out there. I subscribe to them, and so I can get alerts if a new video that's relevant and helpful to me I'll get sent an email and I can watch it. Khan Academy, I'm sure most of you probably know, but if you don't, it's free. It teaches a lot of foundational stuff like mathematics, statistics, psychology, biology, other things like that. And EndNote. So if you're not using EndNote now, definitely start using it. It will save you 50 hours at the end of the year when you're writing your thesis. I knew some people that didn't use it, and it was just a bit of a nightmare when it came to formatting all of the citations. Here's another helpful hint, is to download Copernio with EndNote. It's a software that allows you to download from a database, say Google Scholar. You can download the paper with the citation, and it will populate your EndNote with the actual PDF of the paper. You can highlight within EndNote, make comments, and cite within Word. So you don't really have to leave Word and EndNote to read all your papers and make notes. I think this is really helpful. Otherwise, if you download the PDF separately, you also have to download the citation separately, and you have to populate the EndNote and link the PDF, and it can just take a lot of time, where time is a bit precious in your honours year. So as a final, very important point is my strong recommendation is to learn to code. I think it's a total game changer. So if you have any interest to work in academia, in particular research, and you want to work with brain-related data sets, whether that's neuroimaging methods, MRI, EEG, MEG, etc., you'll inevitably need to know how to code, at least to some sort of basic level. A lot of neuroimaging analysis is done in MATLAB, which Monash provides to honours and PhD students for free. They also provide free online introductory courses to programming, but you can also find lots of these on YouTube, and some of the ones on YouTube are probably more, are better, more suited for what you'll be analysing in your honours year if you choose to do this. There are also summer schools that I've been lucky enough to attend. These are tailored more to PhD students, but also allow honours students with a background or interest in coding and analysis of complex human data sets. So there is the Complex Human Data Summer School at the University of Melbourne. I think it's run at the end of the year. And that's run by Amy Perfors, Charles Kemp, and Danielle Navarro, and all of which completed their PhDs at Ivy League institutions in America. Neuro Academy, which unfortunately this year was run online, but it's usually run at the University of Washington eScience Institute in Seattle. And if you apply for that, you also have the option for a scholarship to fly you over. Who knows, depending on the COVID situation, what that will look like next year. But still, if you're interested, definitely apply. And Neuromatch Academy, which is an online school for computational neuroscience. And I think what's great about this is they match you up with people in a similar field. So for myself, it was brain stimulation techniques, and you tackle problems and learn online. And it's a great way to meet peers in your field, and I think this will also open doors in the future if there is an option to, say, go into a PhD overseas or wherever, you know, at least you're already on their radar. And the other great thing about the Neuro Academy website is they post all of their presentations from previous years online on different analysis methods. So if that's something that interests you, definitely check that out. So thank you for participating in the webinar. If there are any questions, further questions, or if there's more questions we need to answer from Jess's presentation, we can do that now. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was an awesome presentation. And we've had a few questions come through as well. But maybe what we can do is circle back to two of those questions that we missed before. So this question is saying that I'm aiming to hopefully go down the neuropsych pathway for honours and beyond. Obviously 2020 is not a great year for it, but would love to know if you could recommend any opportunities, resources, or absolutely anything that would give me an edge. I know usually there is an undergrad research internship offered and more volunteering opportunities, but because of the current climate of those, some of those are limited. Are there any other resources or recommendations or tips that might bolster or improve or give an edge for the student?
Oscar, are you going to tackle that one?
Yeah, well, so just one point at the beginning I wanted to tackle is, so for honours, the only requirement for getting into honours is grades, because there isn't a interview for that. So for your honours year, you need good grades to get in, and that's it. Once you get beyond that, let's start where you get into these the interview processes. Again, master's, clinical, PhD, honours is the biggest hurdle, because I said in one of the answers, I think there was about 150 people applied for the clinical neuropsych doctorate. I think about 20 got an interview and 8 got in. But the biggest hurdle was getting an interview, which was just based on grades. Once you get an interview, that's when you really want to focus on just showing that you've thought about this and you are actually keen. You're not just applying for a bunch of courses, you have clinical experience. Like Greg said, if you go into an interview and they're like, what research experience do you have? And you say, I want to do this study, I want to record brain activity, I've learned how to analyze the data through coding. They're going to be like, wow, this person's so prepared, that looks really, really good. So that's definitely something you can do to bolster yourself.
And I guess currently with the current climate of COVID and isolation, and I guess there's not as many opportunities that you can do physically in person. But like Greg mentioned, there are lots and lots of online resources that you can, or workshops that you can apply for, that you can do from home, from your laptop or your computer. And that can, I guess, broaden your skill sets. And then you can kind of use that to your advantage, and also just to build confidence that you know what you're talking about and you know how to approach a certain issue or task. So there are surely, like Greg mentioned, lots and lots of workshops and skill building that you can do in terms of that. And also I think from my talks with people who work with hotlines or support services, their support services are still running, so you may still be able to find volunteering opportunities with Lifeline or other mental health hotlines, but also support for disability services are also look really good and show that you have a genuine interest and compassion for helping people, and how that might translate to clinical masters, if that's the route that you'd like to take. Great. So other questions. So okay. So Oscar, regarding the previous question on clinical masters versus clinical PhD, would a clinical PhD better equip one as a clinician with so much more coursework and placement hours? Oscar, take it away.
Yeah, I actually just finished typing a response to that in the chat. So I might read the detailed response in the chat, I guess, if you want some information about that. Long story short, I think so, but I'm biased because I did one. So, but I think it does.
Yeah, and I think also to keep your focus on what you're trying to achieve. Do you want to work with patients? Do you want to work in research, or do you want to do a bit of both? The clinical PhD will give you more flexibility to choose multiple pathways or work in different fields at one time. Whereas if you choose a master's, although you're doing a research topic and a thesis, you are gearing yourself, it's shorter, and you're focusing more on placement and developing counselling skills relevant to that field. And a PhD is gearing you up to work just in research or industry, but still doing research-based skills and work, using research skills and data analysis to answer research questions. So it's about keeping your focus on what do you want out of this, what career do you want, and a master's will gear you up to be a great clinician, but a clinical PhD will also give you a wide variety of different skill sets that will also help you, but it's not necessary to be a clinician, but I guess you can call yourself a doctor at the end of it. So yeah, so that it's just, I think that really helped me at the end of, or during honours, to work out what I want to do. Just focus on what do you want for your career and your life, because that's what's most important, and then work your way backwards and choose a course that's going to best suit you to get there.
Yeah, one thing I would add is, if you're not quite sure what you want to do and you want some time to figure it out, I mean, I wasn't sure. I was torn between research and clinical work, and so I did the clinical PhD because it allows you to do both. Also, you really only get one chance to properly train yourself. If you get less placement hours in a master's and then you actually go out into the field, it's hard to get a paid job working with populations you haven't worked with before. Whereas in the training in the clinical PhD, you get more time to get those skills, and it's much better to get them while you're training rather than when you're out in the field, I think.
Okay, and another question. Hi, Oscar. You mentioned in your answer to a previous question on the PhD that all decisions during the application stage are made based on grades. The minimum grade requirement is currently around H2A, which I believe is 70 to 79. And if we are sitting just under a H1 but have a H1 thesis, is it likely we will be accepted for an interview if we have clinical and research experience, or is it purely grades for the interview?
That's a bit of a tricky one. It varies based on courses and based on year as well. A lot of universities primarily for the PhD look at your honours grades rather than your undergrad one. So, you know, if you get H1 for all your honours stuff, I think you'd be looking very good for getting an interview. Typically for the interviews, what they do is they actually just put you in a spreadsheet with your grades, and that they pick the top people, because a lot of universities don't want to give out a position unless you're guaranteed to get a scholarship. Because if you don't have a scholarship for the clinical PhD, it's quite tough to sort of manage all that. And they've sort of found if you don't have a scholarship, you're less likely to finish. So that's sort of why they look to the grade, so they can say, okay, these people are definitely going to get a scholarship if we let them in. Now we go to the interview and see which ones are the best sort of candidates. So good research and clinical experience won't necessarily make up for really low grades, but if you have both, that's sort of where you want to be. So, you know, even if you got very high grades but no experience whatsoever, it's going to be a bit more difficult than someone, but you know, who still has a H1 but has much more experience. So yeah, definitely the H1 thesis will make a massive difference, particularly for your research skills, because that's the most practical experience you can possibly have, which is, I did honours, I did a research study, people thought it was good. That's a pretty good test run for your PhD.
A question just to clarify what you talked about earlier, Greg. You mentioned, I think it was Khan Academy. Would you be able to mention what academy it was and maybe spell it so people can look it up online?
Khan Academy is an online resource for learning lots of different subjects. I think it's spelt Khan, like academy, so Khan Academy. There is also another academies that I did mention, which was Neuro Academy, and there's NeuroMatch Academy. So Neuro Academy is a great website. Just type that into Google, you'll find it. And they've got lots of past videos of presentations that they've given on different analysis methods for different types of cognitive, psychological, brain-based data sets.
Just touching base with a few students who have asked whether a recording will become available of this webinar. Yes, we are recording, and we will provide a recording to attendees, so you can watch it back and double check with any information that you may have missed. And another question for you, Greg and Oscar, and Jess, I guess. What would you need to use coding for in psychology? And yeah, this is a great question, because coding may not be relevant depending on what your goals are and what type of research you work toward.
So I'll start. I mean, someone who, you know, I'm not in a clinical psychology stream. I only did a minor in psychology, but Oscar will be able to give more information on what he used coding for in his PhD and how it relates to the clinical psychology. But any brain-based data set, even if that means behavioral data set, if you're trying to answer a question that requires human behavior, you'll inevitably capture a really large data set. And the only way to get meaningful results on large data sets is to analyze them using lots of different parameters. And in order to do that, you'll need to know how to do some basic level coding, especially because a lot of the time with behavior, because it's so variable, and also, you know, brain-based measures of neural activity is so variable, whatever question you're answering will mean you need to tailor something specific. There's probably little chance that someone else has done exactly the same thing as you and develop some sort of program that you can just plug and play. Often you'll have to adapt things, methods that other people have used, and the way to adapt that is to be able to program in particular MATLAB or Python. Yeah, and you know, this probably might not be relevant if you're just doing clinical psychology and you want to go into treatment, but I think even then it's probably a bit of an, it's definitely a good edge or like a sort of tick on your name if you're applying to do a clinical psychology PhD, or even as an RA. I know it definitely helped me get my position at ECIMH as an RA, because they knew that I was able to handle large, complex brain-based data sets.
Yeah.
Oscar, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would add that pretty much what Greg said, I entirely agree with. It depends on what kind of research and what kind of clinical PhD you're doing. So if you do clinical neuropsychology, which is what I did, and I'll be giving a webinar on that in a few months' time, it's that entire discipline is about the connection between the brain and behavior. How does the brain work in healthy individuals, and what is going on to create this sort of neurological and psychological clinical conditions? So in that case, if you are ever recording any sort of biological or neurological data, you are going to need to learn how to code. So this can include, you know, EEG, any sort of neuroimaging, MRI, even if you sort of have like blood samples. Then there's things like in the clinical PhD, you might not necessarily, so if you might not necessarily need coding, but even then, if you're doing any sort of sleep research, you'll need to do it, because the data sets are just so massive, and there's no program with buttons you can click to analyze it. You actually need to sort of write code to learn how to do it. Now, if your research is just, well, not just, but looking at, say, like ways to improve therapy, your data might not be that complex and you might not need to learn how to code. But if you want to go anywhere near neuroscience or brain imaging or anything, you will need to learn coding. But if you just want to be a clinician and you want to deliver therapy and your research is just going to be around ways to do that, you might not need to learn coding, and it might not be something you need to spend your time focusing on. But if there's any sort of, you know, any of that kind of data I mentioned, or any sort of neuropsychology, neuroscience stuff, I would really recommend it. It's, you know, spending a month before your PhD learning it will save you 6 months in your PhD. So it'll all pay off in that regard.
And just to add to that, for instance, I worked on a honours project that was neuroscience based, but based on my research question, compared to a partner on the same program, in the same project, our research questions were different. So we were looking at slightly different data. And for that reason, she spent weeks and weeks having to code and process EEG brain data, whereas I looked at muscle responses in the hand as an indirect way of measuring brain activity, which didn't require me to use necessarily specific coding, but I did have to transform that data using various spreadsheets and programs to get values that I could actually use as my data points in my research question, to answer my research question. So the research question difference means that you're looking at different data sets, and you may need to transform the data to get the values so that you can actually analyze the data and actually answer your research question. So it really just depends on your research question and the type of data that you're working with. Can we get the PowerPoints used for these presentations? So we will be releasing a recording, but at this stage, I'm not sure whether we will release presentations. Yep. Okay. Yep. Is that a yes, we will, Oscar, or is that a?
We hadn't planned to release them, but I guess that's something we'll just chat about afterwards and see whether we are. The only yeah, we'll let you know, but there definitely will be a recording if there's any parts you want to go through as well.
And another question, if we have any questions in future, would it be okay if we email you directly? Yep, great. Okay, so yeah, so we are happy for that. And so we can provide those emails to you.
I responded to that one with my email, so.
Okay.
An anonymous attendee now has my email.
Okay, great. And just a question from earlier. So just with clinical psychology PhD programs, could you clarify what you mean by research and clinical experience? Because I think maybe people aren't necessarily sure on what the different types of experience is.
I mean, I can respond to that. So obviously, so with any of these clinical PhDs, and again, to reiterate sort of the previous point, there's different types of PhDs. You can do a PhD that's just research. Once you finish that, you can't work in a hospital, you can't deliver therapy. That's one thing. But if you do the clinical PhD, it's combined sort of training to be a psychologist and research as well. So when we talk about the different skills, one of them is, have you ever worked with people with say depression or any sort of psychiatric condition? Because the course it's challenging, it's a long time, and when you go for an interview, they want to know, is this really what you want to do? Because you might apply for a clinical course, but you've never actually had any exposure to someone with any of these conditions, and you might go to your first placement and think, oh, I did not like this at all. And so really what they're looking for is, have you had some experience? Are you going to sort of finish the course? Have you decided this is what you want? And if you get into the course, can you just start your research straight away because you have some experience doing these sort of things? So, something like, oh, I worked on a study here, or I volunteered at a research centre, I've collected data before, I've, volunteered at Lifeline and helped people there. I have the, the skills, the temperament to manage that. So they're the sort of, I guess, skills or experience we're talking about there.
Great. And I'm just going to double check that there seem to be a few more questions that may have popped through. Would your topic for your honours project inform the field or topic that you would go to do in a potential PhD project, or could you focus on an entirely different area?
Thanks, I'll take that one. You can do an entirely different area. It does not matter at all, especially as Greg was saying, if you're doing the psychology honours program, it's a lottery system to what project you will get anyway. So you often don't get to actually choose what your project is specifically in honours. But yeah, it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is, if it's helpful if that is the same one, because it'll save you a lot of time in learning about it. So someone in my year level did their honours and PhD with the same team, and they came into the PhD having already published in this area. So they had a lot of knowledge, which was really good. But it doesn't in any sense, you're not limited by what you did in your honours. I mean, my doctorate was looking at transcranial direct current stimulation in depression, and my honours project was looking at sleep cycles in people living in Antarctica. So not really the same thing whatsoever. So, you can change. So just focus on something that you find interesting. Anyone's memory is 100 times better for something you're interested in as compared to anything else. You can see people who have terrible memories, but when they talk about like football or something they like, they're like a savant. So if it's something you're interested in, it's going to make it a lot easier. So just follow your interests, and I think it'll make your life a lot more enjoyable, and I think you'll do better as well.
There's just another question that I answered, and I think in private, but I was just going to let everyone know. Someone was just asking what particular coding program is preferred for psychology and neuroscience psychology research. So in my experience, it's most likely going to be MATLAB, but it will depend on the lab and your supervisor. In our lab, we use a lot of MATLAB, but I have to also use Python and other programs to extract specific results and transform data. But I think MATLAB is always a good place to start as well. It helps get you in a good frame of mind to understand how a variable works, how matrices work. A lot of Python code that deals with neuroscience will inevitably use matrices, and MATLAB is kind of like the king of matrices. The only good thing, well, not the only good thing, but one of the good things about Python is the coding language is probably easier to understand if you're a total beginner. But if you know you're going to be using MATLAB, start with MATLAB. And Python's open source as well, so anyone can download Python, but it's a little bit of a process to learn how to get started, and you need to download like Jupyter Notebook and other things and set up your computer in a way that you can actually start using Python code, whereas MATLAB is you just download it, register, and then start using it straight away.
Yeah, and as Monash students, you get access to these things. So you'd be surprised how many programs you can actually download on your computer as a Monash student. I don't think a lot of people know that, but and I logged in the other day, there was about 100 ones that I didn't know about. So worth looking at. And just to really nail this point again, this is really only relevant if you want to do neuroscience or clinical neuropsychology, but this sort of coding stuff, we're sort of hammering it on, but if that's an area that's going to be required for your research, it's just so helpful because you need to know it before you need to use it. So if you're like, good, it's time to analysis, I'm going to start analyzing my data. No, you're going to start figuring out how to install MATLAB and spend 2 months trying to figure that out, and then you'll have to analyze it. So just getting started before you're sort of under the hammer is helpful.
Yes, definitely. Preparation meets opportunity. Another thing to add about coding where you can learn about it, there are places in the city that are probably doing online workshops as well, like General Assembly. They have some workshops to do with how do you actually use a program like Python and other programs, I think like R. And they also just give you a bit of a general rundown on data analysis and why you would need to use data analysis. So there are resources out there, and definitely workshops are a great way just to upskill or just even up knowledge so that you can just be prepared as much as possible so that you can hit the ground running. Like Oscar said, it will really save you a lot of heartache and a lot of pulling hair out when you are feeling under the pump, but you also need to take the time to actually try and learn how to do something first. So definitely worth it. I believe that is all the questions for today. So that's great. And just really hope that this webinar has given you some insights about how you can prepare better for honours or PhD, and or how you might even maybe refine your current approach if you're already in honours or PhD. So yes, thank you so much for attending and hope you found it enjoyable.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.